All right, so I hope you enjoyed the lecture on writing about literature, writing literary analysis. Um, Maybe enjoyed isn't the right word. It probably wasn't the most riveting lecture, but I hope you found it helpful. Really is my goal there. And now we're moving on to the Odyssey, which is the big, major text from this lesson, the famous epic. One of the things we've talked about in this class is the importance, the relevance, the significance of these texts to our world today. If they are truly great works or masterpieces, then as much as they teach us about the culture of their time and place, they should also transcend that culture with some universal themes and ideas and lessons that resonate today and can help us in our lives today. And the Odyssey along those lines is probably one of the most influential texts of all time. People still really read it and enjoy it, even though it's thousands of years old. So why? Why do they still read it and enjoy it? Well, we're going to unpack that in this lesson. And just to illustrate, the cultural relevance and significance of it even today, here's the cover of an album by a heavy metal band who wrote an entire 24-minute song telling the story of the Odyssey fairly recently. So that right there, shows the popular and cultural relevance. But what makes it such a captivating story? We'll dive into that. So as we dive into it, let's practice some recall. So again, these are a couple of questions to kind of bring you up to where we are now based on where we last were. And so the first question I ask is, based on your reading of the Iliad, what are some themes of ancient Greek literature? How would you characterize the beliefs and values of the ancient Greek culture? So maybe pause here, try to answer this, because it would be good to have these things in your mind as we discuss the Odyssey. Themes were a big part of the Iliad, and I kind of explained that. So if you kind of list those out again, you can then, as we go through the lecture, think about, do these themes show up in the Odyssey? And moreover, how does the Odyssey kind of revise or update Homer, the author's stance on those themes? And then how would you characterize the beliefs and values of the ancient Greek culture? These texts, in part, serve as a window into these ancient cultures. And so we can learn a lot about ancient Greece by reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and Sappho and learning about what the ancient Greeks loved and valued. The second recall question is, what are some unique features of the epic poem as a literary genre? So on the one hand, we've got culture. We've already learned about the Greeks, so you can kind of use that for some context. On another end of the spectrum, we've got genre, the style of writing of the literary text. So you can also use that for some context. And so what were some of the traits of the epic poems we've read, of Gilgamesh and the Iliad? They have a long narrative structure. They were originally written in rhyming verse to help the oral speakers remember them. They're usually about a hero, sometimes about a nation, the hero representing that nation. Usually the hero goes on a journey with some outward physical challenges and some inward growth. Few things there. You should make your own list, pause and make your own list and keep those in mind as we study. So historical context. With the Iliad, I already gave the context of Homer, what we know about him. So I just want to add a few things on the Odyssey specifically. This is the second, the later written of the two Homeric epics. And so remember, there was this long history of the Greeks telling stories out loud, and the legends surrounding the Trojan War were part of that oral literature. And then Homer took kind of one scene, one moment, these last days of the war and how they played out for Achilles, and created a story about Achilles' outward struggles and inward growth in the Iliad. So the Odyssey is kind of another story born out of that. It's the second of the two epics, and it's about Odysseus, who was important but relatively minor character in the Iliad. It's about his journey home after that war, the Trojan War, is over. And in a way, it's a more mature, more advanced text because it's a later text. And so it kind of builds on the themes from the Iliad. And as much as the Iliad is very captivating with its battle scenes, in some ways, the Odyssey is a more compelling, more interesting story. One thing that's important to take into consideration with these Homeric epics, which just means an epic poem written by Homer, is the very first word of the text. And so the first word of the Iliad was that Greek word that means rage or wrath. And remember, book 1 was called the Wrath or the Rage of Achilles. And so his wrath or his rage influences the entire text. It shapes the narrative events, his exhausting of his rage and his wrath causes a lot of the main events. So the first word of the Odyssey is similarly important. The first word of the Odyssey is andra, which is Greek for man. And so it's all about the human person. And what's interesting is we see some change and some growth, perhaps at least a little bit, and we can debate how significant that growth is in Achilles from the beginning of the Iliad, where he's so prideful and self-focused, to the connection he makes with Priam over their shared grief at the end. But even if we really argue, even if we really take the stance that's some significant growth, it pales in comparison to the changes that Odysseus experiences, his suffering, and the growth that comes from it in the Odyssey. And so the Odyssey, the Iliad, the title Iliad, that word means Troy. So the Iliad is really about nations fighting, but the Odyssey is about this man and his journey. So just some quick notes on what that journey is like. It's a journey from war to peace. And so it requires different skills from those needed on the battlefield. And the implication is they're different from those possessed by Achilles. So Achilles is this great warrior. Odysseus is a good warrior. He's got strength and physical courage, but he's not half god like Achilles. I believe there was someone way back in Odysseus' bloodline who was half god. So he's got maybe 1/16th, 1/32nd god in him, but not much. So he does have strength and physical courage, but he's much more a man, a mortal person compared to Achilles. And so what he really has as his asset are brains. He's the cunning hero. Remember that term was used by Homer to describe him in the Iliad. And so he's the most clever of those who fought at Troy. And so as much as the Iliad is a story about how one conducts themselves in war, and the choices Achilles makes at the end of it show, the honor he has, the respect he has for the soldiers on the other side. So as much as that is a story about how to conduct oneself in war, the Odyssey is a story about how to go from war to peace. And remember, in the legend, Achilles dies at the end of the Trojan War, just after the events we see in the Iliad. And so he doesn't make the journey from war to peace. He is meant to die young gloriously, whereas Odysseus lives to be a very old man and rule his kingdom. And so, in many ways, the Odyssey is about making the journey from war to peace, which is a hard transition. And I think the suffering and physical, mental, spiritual struggles Odysseus undergoes are very relevant today, when we think about veterans adjusting to life at home. So on the one hand, the Odyssey is very much about Odysseus the man, but it's also about man in a broader sense. It's about what Odysseus shows us and teaches us is applicable to the entire human race. One example of this is the poem has a particular interest in the diversity of cultures and ways of life. So the Iliad showed us, just a couple of cultures, the Achaeans, who are Greek, and the Trojans. Whereas here, Odysseus visits all kinds of places and sees a wide variety of cultures. This gives us glimpses of the distinct ways of life in the Greek world. Remember, Greece had all these different city-states, and it was almost like a collection of little nations rather than one unified country, and you had very different places. And so one of those places, Sparta, was very wealthy. They had the big armies. But Ithaca, the kingdom that Odysseus rules over, is actually quite poor in comparison to big city-states like Sparta. And so you get to see kind of these differences. You get more of a glimpse into what Greek life was like beyond the battlefield in the Odyssey. And showing multiple encounters between the Greek hero and people who are very different from him, the poem invites us to think about how we ought to behave toward people who are not the same as ourselves. I think this is a theme that really emerges at the end of the Iliad when Achilles is able to make this connection about grief with Priam, even though they have, very different views because they're fighting on opposite sides of the war. I think that theme goes from being kind of this important but very late theme that shows up at the end of the Iliad to becoming one of the main, most prominent themes of the Odyssey. And so the Odyssey is very much, the Iliad's about how to be a person fighting in a war. The Odyssey is about how to be a person living in the world. And a big part of that is interacting with others. And a big part of interacting with others is interacting with others who are different from yourself, who have different values. And so the the Odyssey can really teach us a lot about how to interact with, how to treat people who are different from us, which is a great lesson to learn. I think part of the text's appeal today. If you remember from my lecture on the Iliad, I said this is the long story with a complex plot, and we're only reading a few of the books. So I outlined the plot of the Iliad for you. I'm going to outline the plot of the Odyssey for you now. The basic scenario, which I should give you before I go through this, is Odysseus is king of Ithaca. He's married to Penelope, and when he left to fight in the Trojan War, he had a very young son, like a baby really, named Telemachus. And the Trojan War lasted 10 years. When he leaves the Trojan War, some things happen on the way home that delay him, and it takes another 10 years for him to arrive at home. So it's 20 years he's gone, and Telemachus is, and I think in his 20s or 30s by then. And so it's the problem is there's these suitors, we call them, people who think maybe Odysseus is dead or want to think he's dead since he's been gone so long and no one's really heard from him, and they want to marry his wife mainly so that they can become king and rule over his kingdom. So they're in his home imposing on him. They're eating all of his food. They're being very unkind to Telemachus, and they're kind of seeing Penelope, his wife, as a conquest. And so that's a bad situation, to put it mildly. And so he's got to get home. So there's this tension, this conflict. Conflict is always central to any narrative, driving it the whole time, where Odysseus needs to get home to rescue his wife and his son and his kingdom, but all of these things are preventing him from getting home, and that's part of what makes the story compelling. So now that you know the basic tension here, in the basic premise, I can go through the events. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is the events do not happen in sequential order. So the Iliad is a short series of events from a short part of the Trojan War, but they all happen in chronological order. Here, we start in the middle of the story, and there's a long part where Odysseus tells us, like via flashback, what has happened before. And that's very important to understanding the structure and the narrative. So you should understand that going in. It's 24 books, like the Iliad. In books 1 through 4, you get a glimpse of Odysseus's life, or not his life, but his home, with what it's like with him absent. You see the suitors, Penelope, his son Telemachus. So books 1 through 4 set the stage and show us the conflict. They show us things are not good in Ithaca, and Odysseus needs to get there, and Telemachus is starting to appeal to the gods. But this is at about the end of the 10 years. This is just about time that Odysseus gets home. So what has happened the past 10 years leading up to this point? Well, we'll find out soon. In books 5 and 6, which is where our required reading starts, Odysseus is the same time still, close to the end of the 10 years. Kind of like the Iliad, almost at the end of the 10-year span, Odysseus is trapped on an island with a sea nymph named Calympho. At this point, he's lost his ships and his men. He doesn't have a boat or a single soldier helping him. He's all by himself. He's basically shipwrecked on this island, and that's why he can't escape it. And Calypso's fallen in love with him, so she wants to keep him there, and he doesn't foresee any way out. And that's book 5. But what happens in book 6 is a different sea nymph, one who's more sympathetic to him, kind of takes pity on him, gives him her veil. Her name is Ino, and he's able to use this veil. It like gives him superpowers and able to swim through the water. And so he's able to make it off Calypso's island and make it to another island where a group of people called the Phaeacians live. And so books 7 and 8 are about Odysseus' encounters with the Phaeacians. And they're very enchanted with him. Remember, he's a great speaker, and he also has physical prowess. So he kind of, you could say, woos the Phaeacians with his speech. And then he also impresses them when he competes in their athletic contests. So book 7 is him speaking to them, and book 8 is the athletic contest, and he impresses them greatly. And they say, we want to hear your story. Tell us your story. Remember, this is almost the end of the 10 years. So books 9 through 12, then, he recounts his adventures and everything that happened up to this point. And so that's why I've asked you to read books 5 through 12, is so that you get the journey, that struggle, what's happened on it. In book 9, he tells the Phaeacians about 2 of the first adventures after he left Troy, with the Lotus Eaters, and then one with the Cyclops. The Cyclops is very important. The Cyclops is one of the keys to the story. Cyclopses were a race of giants in Greek mythology who only had one eye. The particular Cyclops that Odysseus and his men encounter is named Polyphemus, and he wants to eat Odysseus' men. So they try to escape, and as they're escaping, Odysseus with a spear blinds Polyphemus and enables his men to escape. But what happens is his pride comes into play. Remember pride from the Iliad, an important theme? As they're leaving, after he's blinded Polyphemus, he cries out his name. He says, I am Odysseus, or something to that effect. And Polyphemus, the Cyclops, is actually the son of the child of the sea god Poseidon. Not a person you want to make angry when you're trying to sail across the sea to your home. And now Poseidon knows who's blinded his son because of Odysseus' pride. And so Poseidon then makes their journey home very difficult. So Odysseus has kind of created his own problem here. It's going to be hard for him to get home because he called out his name, because he was prideful. And so some of the things that happened to them on the way home involve, in book 10, he tells the Phaeacians about the time he crashed on the island with a goddess named Circe. And at first she's their enemy. She turns his crew into pigs, but he eventually stays there for a few years, has a relationship with her, and through his ability to be a great speaker and be a very charismatic, appealing guy, he convinces her to help them on their way home. And later, they encounter 2 sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, and Circe gives him some advice that helps him get past Scylla and Charybdis alive. Next, he goes under the water, and he tells the Phaeacians about how he went under the water. In book 11, he tells them this. He went under the water, actually to the underworld, where people go when they die in Greek mythology, and he sees people who have died. The 2 main characters and most prideful characters from the Iliad, Agamemnon and Achilles, are both there, and they have very interesting conversations that make book 11 very important. Agamemnon has a speech about how his wife killed him when she caught him having a relationship with another woman. And the Odyssey is interesting because we see very few women in the Iliad. You see Hector's wife, and that's really about it. And then the women who are trophies, but they're incredibly minor characters. And so The Odyssey has a much more complex and nuanced representation of women than the Iliad. It's much closer to Gilgamesh in that sense. And you have Penelope, Odysseus' wife. You have Circe. You have the women among the Phaeacians. You have Calypso and Ino. So a lot of female characters. And Agamemnon expresses some pretty negative views of women when Odysseus is talking to him in the underworld, but we have to be kind of skeptical of that. Is that necessarily what the author thinks? And Agamemnon also says some other things about women that are not as negative that might be kind of subtle clues to what the author really thinks. So that conversation with Agamemnon is very important. And then he also has a conversation with Achilles' ghost. And Achilles expresses something really interesting and says that he wished he had not died young and gloriously and that he were still alive, which is really interesting because he seems like this warrior who's just built to die young and die gloriously. That's his fate, and it fits his personality. So I have questions for the discussion board about both of those conversations. So if you're interested in those topics, pay close attention and take good notes in the margins when you read book 11. Book 12, he finishes up his narrative and talks about the last few adventures, the Sirens, which is a really famous scene, those sea monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. That's really interesting because Scylla used to be a beautiful woman and was turned into a sea monster, and I think she has 5 or 6 heads, and Charybdis is this whirlpool. And the advice Circe gave him was that these two sea monsters live so close together, you can't sail in between them. You won't make it. So you have to go closer to one than the other. And the advice Circe gives him is go closer to Scylla. Because Charybdis is a whirlpool monster, he'll suck the entire ship down. But if you go closer to Scylla, she'll eat some of your men, but not all of them, and that's what happens. He's following Circe's advice. He sails closer to Scylla and only loses a few of his men, I think 5 or 6, one for each head, not all of them. And that's an important scene. It's very culturally relevant today. If you hear someone say, I'm torn between Scylla and Charybdis, that's like an impossible choice. Because neither outcome is good. And so when someone's in that situation, they might say, I'm torn between Scylla and Charybdis. Later on, they land on an island kind of ruled over by the god Helios, and Odysseus' men kill Helios' cattle. And this really angers Zeus, the king of the gods. So finally, Zeus destroys Odysseus' ships, and he gets trapped on Calypso's island. So he finishes his narrative, and he's there. He's where the story started. He's on Calypso's island, and he has no men, no ships. How does he get out of there? We've already covered that in books 5 and 6. So now he's done speaking out loud, and his story to us, the readers, caught us up to the point where it begins. So you have the main narrative begins right at the end of this 10-year period. We see the bad situation in Ithaca in books 1 through 4. We see Odysseus right at the end of his long voyage in books 5 through 8. Books 9 through 12, we get the recounting of what happened up to that point. And then the Phaeacians are so impressed with Odysseus' story that they give him a ship. He's like a guest, a passenger on a ship, and they let him sail home to Ithaca. So the Phaeacians, impressed by Odysseus' story, get him home. And then books 13 to 24, the whole second half, are about him returning home and how he slays, kills the suitors, and reclaims his throne. And so there's a lot that has to happen. The gods are involved. He and Telemachus plot together. It's not something that happens quickly, and that's why that part takes up the second half of the poem. And it's incredibly interesting. If you ever have the chance, read this poem from beginning to end, because it is a wonderful poem. If I could have given you 3 or 4 weeks on it instead of just 1 week of class, I would have had you read the whole thing. It's that good. But we have too many things to cover in this class. And so what I chose to have you focus on were books 5 through 12, leaving out, the other 16 books, which is still a lot to read, but it's well worth it. But that way you see his whole journey, before he arrives at home. Because it's really kind of like two stories, the journey to get home and then the journey to reclaim his home. And what's important to think about here with this line of events is, like I said, the Iliad was about how to conduct oneself in war, how to be honorable and treat your enemies with respect. And Achilles was the right hero for that story because he dies young and gloriously. Odysseus lives to be a ripe old age. And other writers have written tales imagining what Odysseus would have been like as an old man. So he grows to be very old. But he has to go on this 10-year journey first and experiences all kinds of suffering and hardship on that journey while he's separated from his family. And remember, his pride is one of the catalysts for that journey. But that's right at the beginning of the 10 years. And then he has all these other experiences in between. So I think this is where Campbell's The Hero's Journey comes into play. And we have to ask, why does Odysseus go on this journey? Well, would he have been a good king to his people? He was a young king when he left. Now he's 20 years older. If he was that prideful, would he have been a good king? Is he perhaps less prideful when the story ends? Is what he learns on this journey how to be a good king? And so I think this, maybe more than any other text we read, really illustrates that dual inward-outward journey we see in Campbell's The Hero's Journey. That's kind of our theme for the class. And that's one of the reasons that this is such a brilliant and captivating narrative. Okay, let's spend some time now. We've seen the overview. We've seen some of the big themes. Let's dive into just a couple of specific passages and kind of plunge the depths a little more, if you will. We've seen the breadth of the story. Let's see the depth of it now before we go to discussion board questions. And so as we do that, here's a quick recap of the reading questions. And I ask, what important similarities and differences do you see between Odysseus and the other protagonists we have studied so far? Gilgamesh, Jacob, and especially Achilles. So if you've unpaused after trying to answer this, I think this class in a way is a study of the heroic characters. We're reading these texts that don't have a narrative, like Aesop's fables and Sappho's poetry, but the majority of the things we're reading have like a heroic protagonist we follow, all the way through. And so comparing these characters and seeing what they're like can be really useful for learning more. And what's interesting is Odysseus, although he's prideful, he's probably a character who's a little more sympathetic to begin with than these other fellows on here. But I think he's the protagonist we need for a story like the Odyssey. And the second question I asked, we learned much about Greek culture from the Iliad. What are some new things about Greek culture you have learned while reading the Odyssey that you did not notice in the Iliad? So like I said, all the nation states, city-states were very different in ancient Greece, and we really just get an insight to the warlike states in the Iliad, whereas here we see much more of the nuances of Greek culture, the poverty that existed in some places. Some places didn't have good armies. So, what have you noticed? You didn't notice in the Iliad that also serves as kind of a window into Greek culture. All right, I've covered a lot already, and I don't want to keep you too long. You've seen the big themes, you've seen the plot. So I'm just going to ask like a couple questions here, and we'll look at two passages, and that's it. And then we'll transition to the discussion board questions. And what these two passages will do is give us a greater glimpse into Odysseus's character, because like I said, it's really the story of a man and how that man represents the larger human race. And it teaches us about what it means to be human in all kinds of contexts. And so my first question is, in what ways does the text show that Odysseus is a cunning hero? How do we see that he is intelligent and not just a warrior like Achilles? And so I have a long passage here from book 7 where he's telling his story we're not telling his story yet, but kind of first introducing himself to the Phaeacians. And I chose books 7 and 8. Of all the books in the Odyssey, in some respects, they're the most telling because we see him interacting with another group of people, and that gives us insight to his character, which then gives us insight to the whole human race. And so when he's speaking to them at this dinner, the day he arrives, and in book 7 and 8 are the two books with the Phakeans, and book 7 is really like the speaking book, and book 8 is really like the physical prowess book, the two sides to his character. So in book 7, the king of the Phakeans, Alcinous, has basically asked Odysseus, "Are you sure you're not a god? The adventures you've alluded to the things you survived make it seem like you are much more than a mortal man." And Odysseus has an incredibly clever and witty response to that. So hear this. Odysseus, with careful calculation, said, "No, Alcinous, please think again. I am not like the deathless gods in heaven. My height is normal. I look like a human. In pain, I am a match for any man. Whoever you may know that suffers most. I could tell you stories of the dangers that I have suffered through. God's willed it so. But let me have my meal despite my grief. The belly is just like a whining dog. It begs and forces one to notice it, despite exhaustion or the depths of sorrow. My heart is full of sorrow, but my stomach is always telling me to eat and drink. It tells me to forget what I have suffered and fill it up. At dawn tomorrow, help me to reach my homeland after all this pain. May I live out my final days in the sight of my own property and slaves and home." They all agreed the stranger's words made sense, and that he should be sent back home. They poured drink offerings to the gods and drank as much as they desired, then all went home to bed. So it's an interesting situation, because Odysseus has been through all these trials and ordeals and just wants to get home. But those trials and ordeals, the fact that he survived them, kind of puffs him up and makes him seem very powerful. But he has no ship, he has no boat, he has no soldiers, he has no way to get home. And so he's at the mercy of the gods and at the mercy of whoever will help him. And so he needs the Phakeans' help because they have a lot of ships and resources, and they can very easily send him home, no problem, which is what they eventually do. But first he has to win them over. And so he has to show them, without really looking weak, that he needs their help. And so he says, "I've been through all of this, but I suffered. It was not easy. And that makes me like any man. In pain, I am a match for any man, whoever you may know that suffers most." So he's making himself into an everyman here, not a great hero. He's it's not quite humility, but it's a showing of his humanity, that he suffers like anyone else, even though he's escaped cyclopses and sea monsters and sirens. And he really shows his humanity when he talks about his need to eat and drink, that no matter what pain he's feeling, his stomach tells him he's hungry. Basic human function. And so he makes himself not this big, powerful hero, but someone who, as impressive as his story is one of them, is another person. And so that's going to endear him to them and also show them that he needs them, making them feel needed, making them feel akin to this guy who has survived all kinds of things. So it's true, but it's also incredibly clever. And that's the genius of Odysseus, as a person. So let's look at another speech. This one is from book 8, which is, book 7, as I said, like the talking book with the Phakeans. In book 8 is the book where he competes in the athletic games, and in addition to his great speaking abilities, also wins them over through the physical prowess he does have, even if he's not as strong as someone like Achilles. And so what happens in this scene is this really buff, strong Phakean dude is like, "Odysseus, you're not that strong. You're not that tough. You're a weak little guy." And he's just kind of boasting very pridefully. And Odysseus has this great, clever response that deals with his physical prowess that totally disarms and deflates this guy. With a scowl, Odysseus answered, "What crazy arrogance from you, you stranger! The gods do not bless everyone the same, with equal gifts of body, mind, and speech. One man is weak, but gods may crown his words with loveliness. Men gladly look at him. His speech is steady with calm dignity. He stands out from his audience, and when he walks through town, the people look at him as if he were a god. Another man has godlike looks, but no grace in his words. Like you, You look impressive, and a god could not improve your body, but your mind is crippled. You have stirred my heart to anger with these outrageous comments. I am not lacking experience of sports and games. When I was young, I trusted my strong arms and was among the first. Now pain has crushed me. I have endured the agonies of war and struggled through the dangers of the sea, but you have challenged me and stung my heart. Despite my suffering, I will compete. And so here you have he stands up for himself and stands up to this guy's challenge. So in the previous quote, he showed his weakness, his need for things, his dependence on other people. Here, he still points to that. He still talks about how the suffering he's been through has made him a little weaker, but he stands up to this man's challenge. And so it's impressive in a different way. And he's very clever how he points out two kinds of people and says, you're kind of like this one. You're a very good-looking, strong dude, but your mind is crippled. And so it's an insult to this guy, but it's done in a very clever way that's going to kind of makes the other Phakians chuckle and be impressed, without offending anyone other than this guy who's insulting him. And then he says, you've stirred me to anger. So he's showing that he's still passionate. He's still strong, even though he's suffered and perhaps is maybe weaker than he once was. He's perhaps stronger in another sense. He's maybe not as physically strong as he was 10 years ago, but he's still strong enough to accept this challenge, and he's a more humble, wiser person than he was when he first set out on his journey. And then he says, despite my suffering, despite my weakness, despite the fact that I need your help to get home, I will compete. And he does, and he wins in these Olympic Games. He throws the discus and the javelin way farther than this other guy. And now the Phakians are really impressed. So after this, in Book 9, they say, tell us your story. Books 9 through 12, he recounts the events of the 10 years. They give him the boat. He gets home in Book 13, so that in Books 13 through 24, he can reclaim his kingdom. He's returned with the elixir, to reference the hero's journey. He's now experienced the growth and maturity he needs to be a good king, to actually defeat the suitors, who are a much greater foe than this man. And so he couldn't have defeated the suitors. He couldn't have been a good king for his people when he first left Troy, but now he can be. And we can see a lot of the reasons why in this very clever quote. So I hope you've enjoyed our discussion of the Odyssey so far. I'm just going to wind up quickly here by giving you a preview of the discussion board questions, which you can choose from to answer. So two of the biggest themes in the Odyssey that are not really themes in the Iliad, one is hospitality, which was incredibly important to the Greeks. I think I mentioned before that you never knew if a god was going to show up at your house, and they'd be disguised as humans, so you had to be very kind to guests. The Phakians show incredible hospitality in how they treat Odysseus, and the suitors are the opposite. They violate the codes of hospitality when they're lounging about Odysseus' home while he's gone. And so the Greeks really believed in hospitality, and Homer wanted to drive this home in the Odyssey. What about storytelling? This is very important because Odysseus basically gets his ticket home through his ability to tell a good story. So these are two themes to pull on, to unravel, to unpack, to think about in more detail. I'd love to hear what you think about them. Next up, we have discussed how Odysseus' interactions with the Phakians reveal much about him. But what do these interactions also reveal about the culture of the Phakians? So, I wanted to share with you about Odysseus because he's the main focus here, and I just wanted to cover that in the lecture. But as we move to the discussion board and look for you to take the conversation a step further, think about this, right? Because I said one of the things here is this text shows us the nuances of Greek society, shows us how humans can interact with people different from themselves. And you learn a lot about the Phakians and what they value because you have several books, including kind of the interludes when he's telling his story, where we really do get some insight to them. Earlier, I talked about the importance of gender roles in Agamemnon's speech. So what do you think of the way this text represents women? And you can compare it to Gilgamesh or the Bible, even the Iliad, even though that would have fewer examples. And you don't have to discuss Agamemnon's speech, but you can. Certainly that says a lot. And a good way to think about this question would be, what does Agamemnon say? And then how do the actual depictions of women, what are they actually like, and how do those depictions, the actual scenes with women, perhaps kind of challenge or critique or even support, if you want to take the other side of the argument, what Agamemnon says. So a lot to think about there. The other big speech from his Odysseus' journey to the underworld is his interaction with Achilles. And why do you think Achilles regrets his decision to die young and gloriously? First, I think that's surprising. But then I think Homer is more mature when he wrote this, and he's telling a more mature story about a more mature protagonist. So there's a lot to unpack from that Achilles speech. And it's kind of fun to look at this character we read about in another text. It's kind of like the sequel, right? And just two more to consider. This is a really good one. Why do you think Homer chose not to relate the events of the Odyssey in a standard chronological order? Why not just start with the Cyclops and go in order? I think it makes it more interesting. And I also think that we can't completely trust 100% what Achilles tells the Phaeacians in books 9 through 12. Is he a reliable narrator? Because he's trying to win them over. He's trying to get passage home. And so might he embellish a bit? And what is, I said storytelling is an important theme, and that's related to this question. So what is Homer maybe commenting on here by relating the story in this way instead of a traditional way? I've given some hints and some clues, but there's a lot more to this. I'd love to hear what you think. Finally, this is kind of a big question, and it relates to question 3 about the Phaeacians, but you can consider almost anything for this one. At the end of the Iliad, the common grief that Achilles and Priam share helps them see what they have in common, despite fighting on opposite sides of a war. What does the Odyssey teach us about similarities among people from different places and cultures? So Odysseus, as a man, gives us some insight into human beings and what they are like as he goes through this incredible both outward and inward journey, but he meets all kinds of different people on that journey. We learn about hospitality. We see nuances of different cultures. So what do we learn about what maybe Homer believed about how one should conduct themselves as a person interacting with other people, especially people who are different from oneself? So the Odyssey has a lot to teach us, and I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I do.